Thank you, Mary and Megan. Take it away.
So, welcome back. Welcome to Just Bride. We need inside listening voices. A couple things. First, Jamie, roughly how many choices are left? Like, is there a whole box that open?
I just opened the third box.
And we brought 4 boxes.
Yeah.
Which means take copies with you when you go for colleagues, because we have this rule, which is we will not take them back to the CCBC. We carried them once, we're not carrying them again. And the whole point is you guys can get them out of tables. So, a quick poll. How many of you are here on your spring break? A few people, you guys get extra credit, because I think that is pretty committed. So spending your spring break doing work. So if you are just joining us, I am Megan Schliessman. This is my colleague Gary Lindgren, and we are from the Cooperative Children's Book Center of the School of Education at UW-Mass. And I'm not going to do the CCBC spiel, because I think you all know. If you don't, come on up to us afterwards, and we will tell you all about our library. We're going to jump right into talking about some of the books for grades 6 through 12 in CCBC Choices 2014, which is the most recent edition of our Best of the Years list. Mary reminded all of you, so for those of you who are new, if you don't want to follow along in the categories, which will be left in order, there is an appendix starting on page 106 that has all the titles in alphabetical order with check boxes. So we're going to dive right in to science, technology, and the natural world. And it's gotten to the point where every time we talk about books in the Scientists in the Field series, I have to preface by going, I know if you've been to these workshops before, you've heard us talk about books in the Scientists in the Field series, which is this wonderful series by Houghton Mifflin that's been going on for about 10 years at least now. If you go to their website, you'll see a really rich body of works. They have a body of books in this series, which always focus on the work either of an individual scientist or of a group of scientists working on the same kind of issue. So we have 2 of the books in CCBC Choices this year. The Tapir Scientist by Cy Montgomery and Nick Bishop profiles the work of a scientist named Hattie Medici. And she, on this particular book, Cy Montgomery and Nick Bishop went down and accompanied her on a research trip into the Pantanal in South America as she was looking to capture and band more tapirs, which is what she studies. These really almost prehistoric creatures. The tapirs have not changed since the Miocene era. It's one of the things I learned reading this book. One of the things I love about this particular book is we meet everybody at the research team, and we get to see what it's like when you're out on one of these research trips with a really limited number of time. Things do not go well right away. They have no luck capturing tapirs for the first few days, but eventually their luck does turn around. As always, this is a book that we can get to find out more about the scientist, how she got interested in this particular field of research that she's in, and really get a sense of what it's like to see science happening in the field. And then Eruption, Volcanoes and the Science of Saving Lives is indeed focusing on a whole group of scientists, both here in the United States and the Pacific Northwest, who are part of the Volcano Disaster Assistance Program, and how they work in collaboration with scientists and researchers and trained volunteers. Sure, I'll just have a peanut butter cup right now. Thank you. So they work in conjunction with people in areas around the world where there is threat of volcanic eruption. And we really see how this is a collaboration between this program of the U.S. Geologic Survey and scientists around the world. And we focus particularly on 2 specific eruptions that have happened. One was in 1991 at Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines, and the other was in 2010 at Mount Merapi in Malaysia or Indonesia. I think it's Indonesia. And the work of these scientists, all working collaboratively, is to try to read all the data to predict when a volcanic eruption is going to take place, but then also try to judge how serious they think it's going to be to decide if they have to evacuate people. And we really get a sense of what a serious decision this is, because you don't want to get it wrong either way. Because if you force people to evacuate and it isn't a bad eruption, it not only has disrupted what is often fragile local economy, but it also then, you lose your credibility. So the next time you say you have to flee, half the people aren't going to listen. And we really see how that plays out. So
that we have about dinosaurs, and then they create art depicting what they think based on that information that dinosaurs would look like. So we get to see how those images have really changed over time. I don't know if anybody like me grew up with, I think it was the 1950s, those paperback science Life series or something, and that I remember the dinosaur one so clearly and paging through it. Well, the art is actually, it actually looks a lot like that. But we've learned so much since then. So one of the things that used to be believed, for example, is that dinosaurs were all cold-blooded, that they were really slow and lumbering and they dragged their tails. Well, now, taking information, so much more information than just dinosaur fossils, we know that actually that's not true. They learned by looking at trackways, which are dinosaur paths that we're actually able to, scientists are able to go back and gather information from those trackways, that we learned things like they didn't drag their tails. They were actually a lot of them were moving really fast, and so there was no way that they could have been dragging their heavy tails behind them and moved that quickly. But seeing dinosaurs that finding out they lived in polar regions, we found out that actually they couldn't have all been cold-blooded, that mothers sat on nests where their eggs were incubating, so much information. And a lot of it is using very contemporary technology, so CT scanners, and being able to look into rock and get information is part of what informs this process. Our favorite example that we love using from this book is right here. This has to do with a husband and wife team of paleo artists who in 1993 created this image of a Deinonychus dinosaur, which if you saw Jurassic Park, which came out in 1993, if you remember the velociraptors, and who could ever forget them once you've seen that scene in the hotel kitchen, how incredibly scary they were. It was really those dinosaurs, that movie, were really based on this team of artists, this depiction that they did. Well, between 1993 and 2000, they got new information about the Deinonychus dinosaurs, and they had to create a new image because they found out they were feathered. And frankly, scarier. With the feathers, those kids would have never made it out alive. But really, you get to see in just 7 years how it really shows how science is always changing. There's always new information coming into the field, and how, in this case, it's artists, but scientists all along the way are having to take that information and kind of constantly recreate what we might know about a subject. And The Nazi Hunters by Neil Bascom. This really falls into that category we're loving of nonfiction books that almost read like fiction. They tell a story where we know the ending. If you know anything about this historical period, you already know what's going to happen, but when you're turning the pages of the book, it can really, you're on the edge of your seat because there's so much tension. So this is talking about mostly Israeli intelligence agents who were trying to track down Adolf Eichmann after the end of World War II, and the many years that went by. This takes us right up to 1960, when they finally feel that they have found him in Buenos Aires, living in a really poor neighborhood, working as a laborer. They positively identify him, and then the team swoops in and basically kidnaps him and takes him, put him in a safe house. And they have to do it all secretly because they know that the Argentinian government is not going to be sympathetic to their mission. So I think the most fascinating sequence in this book is once they have Eichmann in the safe house. They have him there for a little over a week because they're trying to finalize the details of getting him out of the country and back to Israel to stand trial. And that in itself is incredibly complicated. So there's just a small team of men who are living with him in his house, and these are people who, it's been such a personal mission for them to find him. Many of them lost family members in the Holocaust, and this, in so many ways, is such a triumph that they have found him. But they have to now reconcile the emotional state they brought into this situation with this elderly man who seems actually physically frail and sort of meek. And how difficult that is when they're just in this isolated situation with him. Then we get to follow them as they basically smuggle him out on a plane, fly him back to Israel, and the book goes right through the trial and shows a little bit about, for so many Holocaust survivors, how this was still a topic that was really difficult to talk about, an area of so much pain for them, and how his trial, for many, was a very cathartic experience.
And then Tanya Bolden's Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln and the Dawn of Liberty, really looks at Lincoln and his changing ideas regarding slavery over the course of the Civil War. And she does this also drawing in information about the Constitution. What does the Constitution have to say about slavery? Never use the word slave. So what we get to see is really what was happening in the country, the division between North and South, and how he was in this very delicate balancing act, of course, of trying to preserve the Union, of making a decision going to war. So there's all of that going on, and one of the things that was so fascinating, and Mary and I talked a lot about it afterwards, was as we see his changing ways of dealing with this situation and his changing thinking. Actually, when he was running for president, he said he had no intention of arguing with the 13th Amendment as originally opposed, which would say that slavery would not be abolished in states where it already existed, to him looking at how he had to respond to the pressure from abolitionists who felt he wasn't doing enough, and then the whole southern states who felt he was doing too much. And we said it's like GLBTQ issues in politics today, or where they were even just 3 years ago. There is such a direct parallel between the two. So it's quite fascinating reading all of this. It's such an engaging narrative. The voice in this work of nonfiction, I think, is really quite remarkable, because the whole time she's talking about this, there will be moments in the narrative where it really brings it down to such a deeply personal, emotive issue. And I just want to give you an example of that earlier on. As we waited for all of America to repent, to repudiate slavery, we wept, we raged, we prayed over beatings and brandings and bullwhippings, over the rapes, over families fractured on auction blocks, and then there was all that stolen labor. So you really feel what a powerful, important issue this was, not just in theory, but through that voice, really how very personal it was. You cannot separate reading this book, this concept of slavery and emancipation from the understanding that this was about people's lives.
The Great American Dust Bowl by Don Brown is a graphic novel, and it really talks about the Dust Bowl in detail, but it sets the story up by going back even further, 60 to 100 million years ago, and in the opening pages is talking about the plates shifting, the Rocky Mountains forming, and those plains then forming next to them, and then how that land was used and how it changed over time. So when there were buffalo there, when farmers eventually tried to use it as grazing ground for steers, and how difficult that was. And then the effects of World War I and a worldwide hunger, and how it was thought that that need for food could be met by growing crops in that area, which worked for a while, and then the market was flooded, the wheat wasn't selling anymore, and the land had been decimated. So when the rain stopped, it was just absolutely conditions were unfortunately set up for that to be particularly devastating. And then it really takes us into some detail about what it was like, and gives, in the color scheme, it works so well because so much of it is sort of the browns and grays and blacks that make you think of dust and dry. And then also kind of the little snippets of individual stories, how hard it was to live there during that time. And also, and there you really get a sense of it, I believe. But then also the language, because it's beautifully written. So this is talking about a large storm in 1935. In Wyoming and the Dakotas, wild winds, cold and strong, lifted tons of dirt into a churning, roiling, boiling black cloud 200 miles wide. Birds and jackrabbits and tumbleweeds all ran in front of the storm. Electricity coursed through the air, enough to power New York City. The temperature fell 50 degrees. 65-mile-an-hour winds as coarse as steel wool made a monotonous clanking sound. People caught in the open fell to the ground or were slammed there. Dark, swirling winds made it impossible to see even the hand in front of your face.
A boy playing in a field dashed for his home but got lost in the gloom. A driver lost the road, both suffocated. It's really powerful language, and it just, I think it feels so immediate and takes you right to that storm. And it wasn't the last of the big storms. The Black Sunday duster, as it was called, was not the end of the dusters or even the beginning of the end. More would follow, 68 in 1936, 72 in 1937, and on until the drought ended about 10 years after it started. When the rain came, it meant life itself. It meant a future. But that future, as we know, wasn't all rosy from that point on, because the last pages of the book tells us about drought returning. Drought returned in the 1950s, drought returned in 2011, and we've certainly been hearing, despite our winter, in other parts of the country, drought in 2013 and 2014. So it's such a great look at a specific time in history, but also really gives kids an idea of the bigger spectrum of weather issues like that.
March, Book 1 by Congressman John Lewis and Andrew Aiden and Nate Powell is the first of, I can't remember if it's going to be 2 or 3 books, I think 3, that is really looking at the story of his life. And I love the framing device in this first one. It is the day of Barack Obama's first inauguration. And Congressman Lewis, who was, of course, at that event, I think he had a front row seat, is in his office, his congressional office, waiting to be told it's time to leave. And this family is there for the inauguration, and they're walking through the building, and they come into his office, and they feel we're so sorry we didn't mean to interrupt. He said, no, come on in. And he starts talking to them, and there's 2 little boys, and he starts telling them about his life and his childhood. And that's really what this book focuses on, is his childhood and his young adulthood and how he first got involved in the civil rights movement. And so we learn as a child, he was the son of Alabama sharecroppers. This was a family where everybody had to work to contribute economically. So the kids were expected, when there were times when the crops in the fields needed workers, that they were expected to take off from school and do that. Now, he was hungry for education. He loved school. And so he would hide and then sneak out and catch the bus to go to his all-black school and not be there for his family, because it was that important to him to be at school. He also had a gift, an oratorical gift, and he was preaching when he was still just a child. And he actually went off to divinity school in Nashville, and that is when he first got involved in the civil rights movement, because that is when the lunch counter sit-ins began. And one of the things that I found, I think, the most challenging and deeply affecting part of this book is when he's going through the trainings for those. Even more than the scenes when they're at the lunch counters is when they're going through the trainings, and they all had to take turns spewing this vitriolic, awful, hateful things to one another, and the feelings that brought up for people doing that, and how difficult that was to both be on the giving and receiving end of that. It was really, really powerful. So this is a book that does take us through that. It's when he first meets Martin Luther King Jr., but the story will continue. This one ends with him going off for the start of the inauguration.
And then in biography and autobiography, this Yoko Ono Collector's Guides is a really substantial biography of Yoko Ono. It's sort of a high school level book, I would say. And it really is a traditional biography in many ways, in that it takes us through her whole life. So we get to learn about her childhood. Her family moved back and forth between Japan and the United States a couple of times. She had a mostly privileged childhood. They had a fair amount of money. But then during World War II, like so many people, their resources available to them were really cut off, and they lived a much more challenging life. And it really takes us up to her early adult years. I think she was 20 when she moved back to the United States again. And we get to see her really start to come into her own as an artist, as a conceptual artist and as a performance artist. And she was incredibly cutting edge. I mean, she was really doing things that were way ahead of her time, that other people really didn't follow in her path until several years later. And one of the things that is so clear in this book is that Yoko had a really clear-cut definition of what she thought art was. And one of the things she believed is that art was not complete until the observer had interacted with it. So just art on its own isn't the final product. It requires some sort of observation, some sort of interaction from the audience. And we see that in a lot of the performance art she did, where people were challenged to come up and interact with her. But the great example, which I'll never forget, having now read this, has to do with when she first met John Lennon. Because she was having a gallery showing, and she had a piece that was a green apple, just a regular green apple sitting like on a clear lucite base. So picture your Granny Smith sitting there. And John Lennon came to this exhibit, and he saw that apple, and he just thought it was really funny. And he picked it up and took a bite out of it. She actually, even though she thought that she really wanted interaction with the artist, she actually was not very pleased by that. But it did mark their meeting at the beginning of their relationship, because pretty quickly it becomes clear that they just have so much in common, that they have really strongly held and shared opinions on gender and on equality and on politics. And so then we go into their relationship, we get to see how demonized she was by the media. Everybody knows, you can say now, oh, she's a Yoko Ono, and everybody knows exactly what that means. She's splitting something up that shouldn't have been split up. So you get to see how really pretty unfairly she was treated, and then how when John Lennon was killed, there was a really abrupt shift in how the media handled her, and they then had a much more sympathetic portrayal, and it really brings it right up. She's now like around 80, I'm thinking, and there's a relatively recent, amazing photograph of her then. She's really stunning. So just such a fascinating woman, and just even though we get a lot about John Lennon, this is really a book about Yoko Ono, and you really, really feel like you get to know her as a person by the end of the book.
And then Little Fish by Ramsey Beyer, sort of at the other end of the age spectrum. I think she's, maybe 24. But this is actually a really great memoir of her time in college. And what's so fascinating about it is it's a little bit about her childhood as well. And she grew up in a small town in Michigan, very solidly white middle-class town, very, very sheltered and privileged existence. And the thing is, she's aware of that. And so when she was deciding where to go to college, she knew she wanted to go to art school, and she knew she wanted to go to a big city and a place that would really expand her experience and understanding of the world. And so she ends up going to art school in Baltimore. And this is really a chronicle of her experiences. I think just focuses primarily on her first year at art school in Baltimore. It is told, and I'm so sorry I don't have an interior, it's told in a graphic novel format, and actually her art style is it's almost childlike. It's not really polished, but it's also excerpts from the actual online diary that she kept during time. She was also a compulsive list maker from the time she was really young, so a lot of her lists and things are included. And so it's really about how this experience did do exactly what she was hoping for. It really began to expand her understanding of the world in a really first-hand way. She obviously went into this with a very open mind. She has a little bit of an unusual college experience. Not everybody is living in honor housing that is essentially a fully furnished apartment with 3 other roommates. And, but that's just the situation she was in. But her roommates, one of them is lesbian, one of them is vegan. She gets introduced to activism on those issues. And she, through other kids, she's already a punk fan when she comes, so she doesn't like hardcore. Well, she gets challenged on that front as well. I think you need to expand your understanding of hardcore. So I just want to read a little bit, because it really gives a sense of what she was like at the time. Ways to make new friends. Talk to people in class, look friendly but mysteriously cool, or something like that. Participate in campus activities. It seems a little nerdy, but I've already met a lot of people that way in the first week. Join clubs, invite people over, have homework parties. Remember that everyone else is in the same boat. We're all little fish around here, not just me. Other people are probably nervous too. How do I even begin to make new friends? I haven't had to do this since I was a little kid. And then on this page, we get a 4-panel of her, and she's using a computer, and there's 2 guys down there, and they're having a conversation, and one of them saying, cool, and if you're sure about your schedule, I'll buy us tickets now. And the other one's going, yeah, sweet. So she goes, tickets to what? Interacting with new people, to see some bands, a hardcore show. And her response is, hardcore? Ew. And then her thought bubble is, I guess that won't win me any friends, but at least I talked to someone. So, and I think it's her sort of her openness and her innocence that's really, really appealing about this book. And yet she's not naive. She's understanding of the fact that she doesn't know a lot of things. So it's a really sweet but not unrealistic look at a girl's first year at college. I actually gave this to my middle schooler to read, and she really, really enjoyed it a lot. There's nothing in it that would be at all inappropriate for that age group, I think.
And I think so many kids into high school, you know, thinking about what's going to happen that year after you graduate from high school, what you're going to do, that's so appealing.
And one of the things I appreciate is she's really comfortable with who she is. She's a kid who's wearing like denim overalls and wearing her hair braids for most of her first year of college, because that's who she is, and she's really comfortable with that. She's contemplating maybe this boy is somebody I'm interested in, and contemplating that she's never had sex, and what does that mean? So all of these things that I think are really, really true to a teenage experience.
And Contemporary People, Places, and Events. Mountains Beyond Mountains by Tracy Kidder. You might remember his adult book of this title. It came out within the last 10 years, I remember the year. So this is a young adult adaptation of his adult book. It's very, very similar to the adult book if you've read it or if you're familiar with it at all. I would say the primary difference is this book does not go into how his religious beliefs and religion in his life, you know, how that influenced him. But a lot of it is similar. So we meet Dr. Paul Farmer, and we really see how this amazing man has done so much and what drives him to do so. He has 2 different degrees. So he has a degree in medical anthropology and a medical degree in infectious disease. And he brings both of those disciplines together originally in the work that he's doing in Haiti with very poor populations, many of whom are suffering from tuberculosis. And so he's flying back and forth between Boston, where he does his clinical work, and then flies down to Haiti for the weekend and is seeing patients there. And one of the things that Paul Farmer really believes is that you have to treat the individual, so we can see him going to great personal lengths. There's one scene where he has to hike out like 3 hours. Tracy Kidder is there, you know, observing him, and he's like, we're gonna go see a patient, and it's a 3-hour hike to get to their house.
And not an easy hike.
And not an easy hike. Tracy Kidder was, you know, but you know, that's just the kind of thing he does routinely. And so he really believes in individual personalized care, but he also thinks it is so important to see the big picture, and it is not enough to just try to combat a disease without looking at the other big epidemiological factors that are weighing in, like poverty. So we get to see that throughout the book. He sets up a nonprofit, Partners in Health, agency, them work, and then he himself later in the book is also doing work in Africa. So it's such an interesting look at this incredibly intelligent, incredibly driven, passionate man, and like so many people who have those characteristics, he's complicated, and so personally, not always an easy person, as you might imagine, and you get a sense of that too.
Actually, the female companion he has for a good portion of this book is Roald Dahl's daughter.
Yeah.
They were involved early on. Just a little children's literature connection, I thought, because I thought that was really interesting. In the arts, the Mad Potter, George Orr, eccentric genius. This is one of the cyber covers this year. What a fascinating character. George Orr was a potter in the late 1800s, living in Biloxi, Mississippi, and he knew he was brilliant. And he was brilliant. Nobody else thought so. They just thought he was strange, because he was also strange. This is a man who just, well, you can tell by his physical appearance, who just sought to get people noticing him and noticing his art. And he had a huge studio in Biloxi. He really understood the way of pottery as a commodity. And so one of what he did was just churn out a lot of stuff that he could sell to help support his vastly growing family. Didn't he name all his sons George, I believe? At the same time, he was experimenting with form and shape and glaze. And I'll tell you, at the opening of this book, they have some photographs of some of his pots that are not only incredibly beautiful and striking, but they look so 21st century contemporary. And one of the things you learn over the course of this book is this man who was literally, he thought he should be very well known, but he wasn't very well known. But he later became discovered after his death. And actually there's this fascinating part where his adult sons basically had all his pots in storage, like in the back of their auto shop or something after his death. And you know, it was one of these cases of somebody who had a background in art coming along, stumbling along, seeing them and going, oh my gosh. And that's really when he began to start developing a reputation after his death. So absolutely fascinating character who, again, you get a little sense like Mary was talking about with Paul Farmer, this absolutely brilliant mind, and yet living with him, you get a little sense of probably wasn't really, really easy. His family did not feel the need early on to preserve his legacy. Because it was not easy growing up in that household. But, and you know, Jan Grayberg and Sandra Jordan are just so skilled at writing about art for young people in a way that makes it really, really accessible. And then in poetry, one of the things we really miss is when we used to see on a regular basis these great anthologies or thematic anthologies for young adults. It used to be every year we would get them and be really excited by them. And it's been a while. And this one is one that came from a small press to the CCBC, and we're so glad it did. Individual poems for and I'm going to try to read to you. Social justice is a fascinating look at various dimensions of social justice. So this is a book that looks at things like sexism, racism, ability issues. But the way it does it is it does it through poems that are both very, very subtle and very much in your face in terms of the emotion of anger or frustration or whatever. And I just want to read you a couple to give you a sense of the range of tone that you get across this volume. So this first one is called, Sure, You Can Ask Me a Personal Question, and it's by Diane Burns. How do you do? No, I'm not Chinese. No, not Spanish. No, I'm American India, Native American. No, not from India. No, not Apache. No, not Navajo. No, not Sioux. No, we are not extinct. Yes, Indian. Oh, so that's where you got those high cheekbones. Your great-grandmother, huh? An Indian princess, huh? Hair down to there? Let me guess, Cherokee. Oh, so you had an Indian friend. That close. Oh, so you had an Indian lover. That tight. Oh, so you had an Indian servant. That much. Yeah, it was awful what you guys did to us. It's real decent of you to apologize. No, I don't know where you can get peyote. No, I don't know where you can get Navajo rugs real cheap. No, I didn't make this. I bought it at Bloomingdale's. Thank you. I like your hair too. I don't know if anyone knows whether or not Cher is really Indian. No, I didn't make it rain tonight. Yeah, spirituality. Yeah, spirituality. Mother Earth, yeah, spirituality. No, I didn't major in archery. Yeah, a lot of us drink too much. Some of us can't drink enough. This ain't no stoic look. This is my face. And then Sunrise by Mary Oliver. You can die for it, an idea or the world. People have done so brilliantly, letting their small bodies be bound to the stake, creating an unforgettable fury of light. But this morning, climbing the familiar hills in the familiar fabric of dawn, I thought of China and India and Europe. And I thought how the sun blazes for everyone just so joyfully as it rises under the lashes of my own eyes. And I thought, I am so many. What is my name? What is the name of the deep breath I would take over and over for all of us? Call it whatever you want. It is happiness. It is one of the ways to enter fire.
And then a poetry book for a slightly younger audience is Joyce Sidman's What the Heart Knows, Chance, Charms, and Blessings. And she says, she opens up with a note to readers, and in the note she says, I wrote these poems for comfort, for understanding, for hope, to remind myself of things I keep learning and forgetting and learning again. They're about repairing friendship, slowing down time, understanding happiness, facing the worst kind of loss. They are words to speak in the face of loneliness, fear, delight, or confusion. And so it really is celebrating words and their power. She has the contents divided into 4 different sections: chants and charms, spells and invocations, laments and remembrances, praise songs, and blessings. So in the spells and invocations section, it said the sort of subheading is to cause something to happen. And I want to read just one poem here because I can't imagine that we can't all relate to it. This is called Invitation to Lost Things.
come out from your hidden places, hair clips, homework, phones. Come show yourselves, mittens, earrings, socks. Come play your part. Come find your mates, come cleave together. There is a place you belong. For we, careless giants, don't know your dainty paths, can't read the maps you follow. We bow to your littleness, pencils, glasses, keys. Without you, we are lost in this big world of ours. You who wait so silently to solve the puzzle of our days. Haven't we all been there?
And then just one book in the picture books for school-age children that we think would be great to use right on in the middle school and maybe even high school is Margaret Wild and Ron Brooks' The Dream of the Philistine. So the Philistine, if you aren't familiar, it's also known as the Tasmanian tiger. It is a carnivorous marsupial native to, Tasmania, actually, native to Tasmania off the coast of Australia, that is now extinct. And this is a picture book that focuses on the last known surviving Philistine, which died in captivity in the Hobart Zoo in the 1930s. And so here you get a little sense of the narrative, trapped am I in a cage, twisty wire, cold concrete, prowl, rage, howl. Know ye not that I am tooth and claw? See me hunt through bracken and bush, see me swagger across wild lands, see me glory at the edge of a cliff. And then we go into these beautiful sweeping full-page spreads of that Philistine remembering its life before captivity. And so this is a book that will have a series of these just gorgeous imaginings of what it was like, and then we go back to that caged life of the black and white photographs and the narrative. It's just a beautiful book. I think there's a lot for kids to dive into here. And also, really interestingly, those photographs of the Philistine that are incorporated into the art, that is the actual last known surviving Philistine. There was a BBC documentary done of it in the 1930s, and they took those images from that documentary and incorporated them into the artwork.
They're really haunting.
Incredibly haunting, yeah.
Really powerful. And then fiction for children. Mira in the Present Tense is a book we really enjoyed this year. We were talking earlier about books for young teens, and I think that this is a great example. We're going to talk about several, actually. But this is about a girl, Mira Levinson, and actually never do this, but I'm going to read the font copy because it's really good. It says, Mira Levinson turns 12 this month, and the following things are mixing her up. The names of feminine hygiene products, being half Indian, half Jewish, she's drifting away from her best friend and towards the mysterious boy in her writing class. Her amazing artistic Nana Josie is dying, and she's painting her own casket. And the special gift she gave Mira has gone missing, maybe lost forever. And this book just travels that ground, that treacherous ground of being 12, and all of the changes that everybody goes through, and then that personal ground that this girl is trying to navigate, especially losing her really beloved grandma, who is an artist, and she has actually ordered and has delivered, in perhaps I think the first chapter of the book, a casket that is just like unfinished, just plain wood, because she wants to create the art on it. To be used for her own, after her own death, and she wants her granddaughter to help her in that. She's so open about everything she's going through, and that's both wonderful and also really difficult sometimes for her granddaughter, who wishes that maybe she wouldn't be quite that open about it, because she is a very quiet girl, and one of the things that happens in this book is she finds her voice. She finds both her speaking voice, because she's literally quiet. She has a hard time speaking up, whether it's defending herself or even talking in class. But she's in a writing workshop that a local author is running, and she really finds that speaking voice there, and she also finds her written voice, because she really does love to write, and she finds that that's a way to express herself. This is just a really beautiful story, and we get to see how life, even when you're going through something horrible as losing somebody you love, life does keep going on, and there are moments of happiness and joy, like this boy who's in her writing class, who she connects with. It's also a book with great secondary characters. We really loved her parents and her grandmother and their writing teacher, and it just all comes together seamlessly.
And then a little bit lighter is Frances O'Rourke Dowell's The Sound of Your Voice, Only Really Far Away. You might be familiar with a couple of earlier books she has done about these characters, The Kind of Friends We Used to Be, and The Secret Language of Girls. So this is about the same two friends, Marilyn and Kate. It's the second half of their 7th grade year. And in the earlier books, these two girls who had been friends when they were younger, really once they got to middle school, started having problems. They kind of took different paths, different things interested them, and their friendship really went through some difficult times. So they've found some sort of tentative common ground again in this book, and they're both sort of struggling with balancing sort of internally how they're viewing themselves with outside pressures and expectations. And Mary Lynn is a cheerleader, so she's the pink pants and she's there. And she's really into all things popular and cheerleading, but she is having a hard time with some of the demands that her fellow cheerleaders, who I do think are a little stereotypical mean girls, that they're putting on her and things that they expect her to do. And she's just not sure if being popular is worth the price that they're asking her to pay. Kate is pretty judgmental about that. She thinks that's really horrible, and she can't imagine why she would stoop to that. But at the same time, if she's honest with herself, she has to admit she's doing a little bit of the same thing, because she has agreed to help a friend with a project that's going to be sort of in a competition that she's proposed. And then a boy that Kate likes comes up with another idea. She recognizes it's not as good as her friends, but she really likes this guy, so she kind of offers to help him instead. So she's doing something a little bit similar. So these two girls are very distinct, but they're very realistic characters. This is just a perfectly grounded in 7th grade social drama, social landscape, in a way that I think a lot of young readers will enjoy.
Runaway Now. That makes me think we had a group of middle school teachers come to the CCBC on Valentine's Day. I said, you don't want to be in a middle school on Valentine's Day? I can't imagine. Natasha Ferran's After Iris is a book that made us think of the Casson Family series by Hilary McKay. If you know those books like Sappy's Angels and Indigo's Star, because they are such a deft blend of incredible humor with really, really deeply moving family situation. And this story, After Iris, is about a 13-year-old girl named Blue, who is our narrator, and she's actually telling us this story in several different narrative formats. One is sort of the script to the movies that she's making as she chronicles her family's life, and then another is the diary that she keeps. And Iris, referred to as the title, is Blue's twin sister who died in an accident the year before. And so what we are getting in this book is really the look at a family dealing with grief. And the members of that family are Blue, her two younger siblings, Twig, who is 10, and Jasmine, who is 8, her older sister Flora, who is 16, and their parents. And we see how they are all manifesting that grief in different ways. And in fact, for the parents, absence has become their way of dealing with it. They've both thrown themselves into work. So her mom has gone back to work. She works for a really big cosmetic company, the name of which I can never remember, but it's really, really funny. And she's traveling all over the world. And their dad is a screenwriter, and he's off, this is a book set in England, he's off doing extended times in Warwick, away from home. And in fact, Flora, the 16-year-old, is convinced he's having an affair. And so the kids are ultimately left in the charge of a nanny. And I just want to read you a little preface to the scene where they first meet the nanny. First, we get a little bit of Blue's video diary. She's filming her younger brother and sister playing on the swing set, and all of a sudden the swing bonks Jasmine in the head. Jasmine, Twig, it's not my fault, it's not my fault. Flora, I am trying to listen to my music. Then her diary, Friday, August 26th morning. Flora heard something in the kitchen this morning and said it wasn't fair to make her go down alone. Just because I'm the oldest, Flora said, does not mean I have to be the first to die. So we grabbed what we could, which was a cricket bat for Twig, tennis rackets for Jazz and me, and the big oar Dad got in Oxford with all his boat crew's names on it for Flora. For a family that never plays sport, we have an awful lot of equipment. Jazz said Dad would kill Flora if she broke the oar, and Flora said she'd remember that when her entire family had been murdered because she hadn't been properly armed. But in the end, we didn't need to hit the burglar, because when we got to the kitchen, he turned out to be Zoran. And even though we didn't know yet that it was him, he was wearing a flowery apron and sandals and a little goatee that made him look like Mr. Tumnus in Narnia, who everybody knows was on the right side in the end, even if he did have his moments. "Who are you and what are you doing here?" demanded Flora. "I'm your new babysitter," said Zoran. "A babysitter?" cried Flora, "but why?" Zoran gave Jazz what Dad calls a laden look, and she bit her lips so we couldn't see the stitches they gave her at the hospital. So you get a sense of the humor, which is really, really wonderful. And actually, this is a story, the revelation of what happened to Iris is something that slowly unfolds. It's just such an incredible portrait of grief because it does manage to balance that levity and that incredibly deep feeling so well.
And then Claudia Mills and Zero Tolerance, another book about 7th grade. This is about a 7th grade girl named Sierra. And Sierra is one of those girls, you all know her, you're in a school, you've got her in your school. Sierra is a good girl. She always follows the rules. She knows the rules, she follows the rules. That just allows her to move through her life very easily. Teachers like her, adults like her, it all works until the day that she opens her lunch in the school cafeteria, the lunch she's brought from home, and realizes she has accidentally grabbed her mom's lunch instead of her own. They both bring apples for their lunch. Her mom also includes a paring knife in her lunch because she likes to cut her apple up to eat it. Well, Sierra, that good girl who knows the rules and follows the rules, is aware that her school has a zero tolerance policy for weapons of any kind. And so she does exactly what she knows is the right thing. She goes up to the lunchroom monitor, she explains what has happened, the lunchroom monitor quickly dishes her off to the office, she doesn't want to deal with it. Sierra goes to the office, a place where she has always felt very comfortable and very welcome in the past, and when she arrives in the office, the principal happens to be there, and he has been entertaining a guest at school that morning, and he has been extolling the school's zero tolerance policy to his guest. And he has said the reason this policy is so successful is that it is absolute. There are no exceptions. We follow it for everyone. And here is Sierra, who through no fault of her own has brought a weapon to school. Well, the principal feels he has no choice. What is he going to do? He has just said all of this. He needs to follow through. And so the policy states that she is going to go into an in-school suspension and then possibly an expulsion. And so in the in-school suspension, Sierra really is forced to interact with a part of the student body that she never has before because she's, as I said, she's known her place and she has stayed there. But here there are these other kids, and the more she talks to them, as particularly one of them, one boy, she discovers that like what has happened to her, everybody's stories are not just black and white, it's not just clear cut, they're complicated and they're messy. And it starts to give her kind of a different, larger perspective of the world. Well, but to return to that zero tolerance policy and her knife, what I haven't said yet is that Sierra's dad is an attorney. And he is really, really angry at what is happening to his daughter, and he is determined to nail that principal to the wall. The media catches wind of what's going on, and it just turns into one of those big, very public uproars. And we really get to see that the principal is not a bad guy, but he's having a really hard time working his way through this situation. And in the end, it comes down back to Sierra, our rule-following girl who now has sort of changed her perspective, and she's the one who really has to sort her way through this situation and figure out what direction it's going to take. I think this would be a great book for a book discussion. I can imagine middle schoolers having so much to say on the way the story is presented. And then fiction for young adults, The Coldest Girl in Cold Town by Holly Black. If you're here this morning, we talked about dogs. Really good. It's really well written. It's standalone, not part of the series, not number one. And it really grabs the reader. I wanted to say by the neck. From the very first page, because this takes place in a world where vampires are present, everybody knows it, and everybody knows what to do to stay safe. Stay indoors after dark, locks and protections, but something really went wrong at this party a group of teenagers had, because it's the next morning, Tana wakes up and she is one of only 2 survivors. Everyone else has been slaughtered by vampires during the night. So the other person who has survived is her ex-boyfriend, Aiden, but he's been bitten. And he's really being held hostage still in this house where the party was. And there's somebody else with him, a vampire, whose name is Gabriel, but he's not the attacker. And it's just very unclear as why a group of vampires would be holding another vampire hostage along with these humans. But Tana ends up really helping them all escape. And it's, they get out the window just in the nick of time because it's getting later in the day, the vampires have come back, but now Tana has gotten bitten during the escape. So she is really looking at this very uncertain personal future. She's probably going cold, as it's described. She may be turning into a vampire herself. The process isn't complete yet, but the last thing she feels she wants to do is go home and endanger her family, her dad, and her younger sister. So she sets off with Aiden and with Gabriel, the mysterious vampire, to the nearest cold town. Because in this world, there are cold towns, which are quarantined cities for vampires and their groupies. But once you pass over the boundary of a cold town, you can't leave again without having a marker. And you can only get a marker if you turn in a vampire. Gabriel offers himself up to Tana to be the marker. So she goes into the cold town, and there is a constant video feed coming out of the cold town, going to the outside world that shows life there as really glamorous, as really excessive, as beautiful. But like so many things that we watch, it's not a very realistic portrayal because it's actually a very difficult life. The humans, those groupies I talked about who come in, well, their options are really limited once they get in there. And so for Tana, she is personally worried about what's going to happen to her, but the situation gets so much worse because that younger sister that she was trying to protect by not going home, well, that younger sister is entranced by those video feeds. She thinks it looks really, really cool. And then when she realizes that her older sister is in there, she goes too. So now she's in the cold town, and Tana just wants to get her out and rescue her. So it's really, really suspenseful, but I started out by saying it's a romance because, Gabriel, that mysterious vampire, well, of course, feelings start to spark between him and Tana. She's a great protagonist. She's really strong. She wants to do the right thing. She's also a teenager. She doesn't always know what the right thing is, and so she has big decisions in front of her. I think great cover, too. I think it'd be fair. I think a lot of teens are going to want to read this.
As opposed to this cover, which will put them to sleep.
Cover.
However, it is such an amazing book. The Golden Day by Ursula Dubosarski is set in Australia. It opened, most of the book is set in 1968. And the book opens with a group of schoolgirls, they're probably about 9, 10 years old, on a day when their teacher is taking them on a field trip. And this is a class where these girls are used to their teacher doing this. She'll often take them on a field trip to the nearby gardens, where they spend time wandering around and writing in their poetry notebooks, and also listening to the gardener, Morgan, who works there, who is a poet. Now, one of the things the teacher always says, remember girls, these trips are our secret. So they're not supposed to tell anybody that they go on these secret field trips to the garden. So this day they all go down, and the teacher says, Morgan has a special treat planned for us. He's going to take us down the path to the sea caves because there's Aboriginal paintings inside the sea caves, and he's going to take us to see them. And so the girls follow along, and they go down, and they all go into the sea cave, and it is pitch black in there. And here's this group of girls getting more and more anxious, and eventually they're just feeling cold fear, and they all go rushing out of the sea cave. And they wait, and they wait, and they wait, and their teacher doesn't come out. And Morgan doesn't come out. And eventually they go back to school. They don't know what else to do. They go back to school, they show up, everybody's like, where's your teacher? Well, they've been told not to tell. So they don't. And we then go through the next series of days with people coming in and asking them questions every day, and finally one of the girls breaks and confesses everything. And in a way, it's like a relief to everybody in the class. She's finally spoken, but nobody still knows where the teacher is. The teacher has not shown up. Now, the main character in this book, who we're really experiencing this all through, is a girl named Cubby. And as time passes, what we get are these masterful dissembling notes home from the headmistress of the school that never really say anything, but give updates. Well, eventually, enough time passes that they hold a memorial service for the teacher, but still, nobody has actually told any of the girls anything that's happened. And I think one of the things this book does so well, and really what the title references is you feel the whole time you're reading this book like you're looking at it through this gauzy curtain, that hazy curtain of memory. Because it's these kids who are not being given any real information in order to make sense of anything. So they have to try to make sense of it on their own. So they're like, maybe he ran off with her, or maybe they're doing this. So Cubby, in the meantime, makes a really good friend in a girl named Ikara in the class. And Ikara's from a very wealthy family. But the more time she spends with Ikara, the more she's like, Ikara, she's really sort of runs hot and cold. And then she starts to realize Ikara has created this elaborate fantasy around her mother because her mother actually left her. And again, it's one of those situations where Ikara was never really told the whole story, so she's constructed this sense of reality about her life. So that's the majority of this book. And then we jump ahead about 8 years. They're in their final year of high school, final chapter of the book, thank you. And the final chapter of this book just will raise the hairs on the back and make you go, I have to go start it all over again. This is a book that I just thought about it for days after I read it. The writing in it is so remarkable. I think it just, for me, I think one of the most amazing things about the sensibility of this book and that sense of haziness, to me, the most vivid moment is when they're in that cave. The most honest moment in this book in terms of understanding everything is the fear. And everything else is these kids trying to make sense of something when the adults in their lives are not giving them the information and the honesty they need. There's humor in it as well. Like I said, those notes home from the headmistress, oh my God. Cubby's mother is just hysterical because she'll comment on these notes like, oh my God, there's another one. It's very, very funny. And then Sarah Ferguson's debut novel, If You Could Be Mine, fascinating. This is about a contemporary story set in Iran. It's fascinating because what I did not know about Iran is that homosexuality is illegal, but somebody who's transsexual is considered to have a medical condition. And so the government will pay for sex change surgery. Well, that's a dimension that fits into this story, which is about a teenager named Sehar, who has been in love with her best friend Nasreen for many, many years. And Nasreen is in love with Sehar too. So these two girls are in love with one another, but it is forbidden in the culture. And so they have never, of course, told anybody openly that they love one another. And Nasreen is from a wealthy family, and Nasreen's parents arrange a marriage for her. And so suddenly these two girls who have always been able to be together under the guise of friendship are looking at their future being apart. And Sehar is just devastated by this, and she's determined to do something that will allow her to have a future with Nasreen. And it is through her cousin Ali, who is gay, that she meets a transsexual and realizes, wow, this might be an option for me, which right away what I love is that complete naivete. Like somehow she thinks I can just change my sex assignment so that I can live as a man and Nasreen and I can live together. So she's incredibly naive about this, but in her mind it's the only option she has. And she remains incredibly naive about it until she goes to the first meeting with the doctor and understands what this really means to do this. In the meantime, Nasreen, who really loves Sehar, is under this illusion that she can be married and she and Sehar will just continue on secretly. For Sehar, that's completely untenable. She refuses to do that. And so ultimately, this is a book where, in terms of their relationship, there is no easy answer. But what Sehar discovers over the course of this book is that there is a gay community in her city. She is not alone. And that is, I think, one of the big parts of this book is she starts to realize she isn't the only one. So, but really, really well done. I was very impressed with her debut novel.
And Eric Hansworth, this is his first young adult novel. He's written for adults. And this book is set in 1975. It's in upstate New York. And it's about Louis, who's a Tuscarora Indian. And Louis, as a 7th grader, is the only kid from the reservation who's been placed with with the Brainiac group at school. And it was the same thing in 6th grade. And 6th grade was just a horribly dismal social year for Lewis, was not good. He really doesn't see that 7th grade is going to be any better, but things start to look up a little bit when he meets a new kid at school, a boy named George, whose family has moved on to the nearby military base, Air Force base, and he and George discover that they actually have a lot in common, especially their shared love of music. It's 1975, remember, so they're both big Beatles fans, but they are are becoming Paul McCartney and Wings fans, and the chapters of these books alternate between Beatles and has come into the house, and she's just seeing it for the first time. "What is this?" she said, staring at my hair. "I cut my hair," I said. "I'm tired of not fitting in with my class. That 2-foot braid just shouted, 'Reservation kid here,' so I got rid of it." "Go get the buzzer," she said. "What?" "Either you're going to get it or I'm going to get it, but before we eat, we're cleaning that hair up," she said, grabbing a towel to pin around my neck. "You look like a welfare Indian." "I am a welfare Indian," I said. "You don't need to look the part," she said. The buzzer was a garage sale purchase, a hair clipper that made more noise than it should have, grabbed your hair like it was mad at you, and sometimes gave off a burning odor while it did its job. She came at me. 5 minutes later, the longest hairs on my head were in my eyebrows, and they survived only because they were behind my glasses. "The next time you think about caving in to how you believe white people want to see you," she said, sheathing the buzzer in its holster, "you remember this." And just that passage gives you such a great idea of the humor in the book, because it's so very, very funny. And also the really great characterizations. You know, both Lewis and his mother and his uncle who lives with them, just as well as most of the other characters, just really come through as distinct individuals. Well, Lewis does have this new friendship with George, but he is aware that it's only going to be an at-school friendship, because even though George has invited him over to his house, his parents are very welcoming, and that has gone really well, Lewis knows he'll never be able to invite George to his house. And that's because even on the reservation, Lewis's home is just one of the very, very poorest and run down of any of the homes. The kitchen is literally falling in. And Lewis knows that his mother would just be mortified if he brought a white kid home to see how they live. And so one of the parts of humor in this book is that Lewis makes up increasingly ridiculous reasons as to why George can't come over to his house. So this book just really explores their 7th grade year, their friendship, and what happens to friends when you have lies between you, or parts of your life that you feel like you have to keep hidden. It's both powerful in the way it looks at their lives, and also, as I keep saying, but I want to stress it, it's just so very, very funny, really accessible.
It's such a great story about a friendship between two boys, too. And actually, the lie that finally works, that George is like, "Oh, I understand," ties right into that poem I read before, the Indian poem, because it's a lie. He makes up this whole elaborate lie about his mother being shaman, and that she can't have contact with white people. And George is very earnestly understand. So. Oh, Maggot Moon by Sally Gardner, which is one of the Prince Honor books this year, is just sort of a white knuckle gripping read that is really unsettling at the same time, because trying to position yourself in the story is really, really intriguing. It is about a boy named Standish, a 15-year-old boy named Standish, who lives in Britain, and he goes to a British public school with its very rigid system. He is a kid who has struggled to learn how to read. He really stands out physically because of the blue eye and the brown eye. He stands out intellectually because of his learning disabilities. So in this very authoritarian school environment, is not a really happy place for him. Meanwhile, when he goes home, he and his grandfather live in Zone 7. And Zone 7 is a very dismal, rundown area of the city. They always have to worry about the government and what the government is watching and paying attention to. So right where you're going, oh, it's a dystopic, futuristic book, except it's set in the 1960s. And that's really clear from the beginning. So you're going, what is going on here? And whenever they refer to the government, they often refer to the motherland. Well, this is an alternate history in which Germany won World War II in Europe. And the Germans are looking for world domination. They're continuing their effort for world domination. And Standish and his grandfather, therefore, like everybody in Britain have to be very, very careful about who's watching. You always have to worry that somebody's an informant. Usually Hector will go and get the ball, and one day Hector comes back just white-faced by what he's seen on the other side of that wall. Not long after that, Hector and his family disappear. Well, what eventually we learn as we read on the story is that the motherland, Germany, in their effort for world domination, realizes that the space race is probably key to this. And if they can convince the world that they have landed on the moon and are mounting a missile system there, every country left standing is going to just give it because they don't want to be attacked. And what Standish and his grandfather, who we realize is part of an underground movement, have realized is that is what's happening over the wall. The Germans are staging a massive moon landing that they are going to film and use to convince the world that they have conquered the moon. And what they realize is they have to stop it. They absolutely have to stop it. The character of Standish is such a wonderful character. He is I think of him as a sweet dreamer of a boy, with such a good heart, who doesn't think of himself as really courageous, but he ultimately realizes it comes down to him to foil this plot. It is really, really unusual in many, many ways, not the least of which how it ends. So, quite remarkable.
And Peanut is a really quick reading graphic novel. This is about a teenage girl, Sadie, who moves to a new school, and she decides this is the perfect opportunity to make herself more interesting. She's the kind of kid who feels like she's sort of faded into the woodwork, nobody pays much attention to her, so she comes up with a great plan. She is going to fake a severe peanut allergy. And it will just make her intriguing and interesting, and she'll have something to talk about with these new kids that she meets. So she does. She goes to the school, she tells them, she does a couple of other things. She gets herself a medical alert bracelet that she orders online. She casually drops it into conversation. And it really seems to be working for her. She makes a couple of friends. She actually gets a boyfriend at her new school, which is something that she hasn't had any luck with before. And she just needs to remember to maintain that facade, because sometimes it's a little bit difficult. The school nurse has been following her around saying, please get these forms signed by your mother. We need your EpiPen. And she keeps kind of putting her off until the day that there's a school bake sale. And she buys a cupcake and starts eating it. And a teacher, who everyone in the school is aware of her peanut allergy, said there are nuts in those. Calls 911, the paramedics come, the whole facade is blown up, and everyone discovers that she's lied. And so those friends she's made, they were really good friends, and they just feel so betrayed that she lied in that way. So it's just this devastating occurrence for her. But that boyfriend, they had a connection, and there's signals by the end of the graphic novel that he's going to stick with her and give her another chance. As I said, it's a very, very quick read. I love the art of this book. It's really clean, and Sadie is always wearing something red or has a hint of red on her, so it's really easy to follow her through the pages.
And while it's such a huge sort of premise, the reality is teenagers can do majorly stupid things all the time, and what I love is there's yes, you can come back. The Summer Prince by Elia Dodd Johnson is a true work of science fiction, which we don't get that often in young adult literature. It is set 400 years in the future in a city called Palmeiras Trace, which is in what we now know of as Brazil. And this is a tiered city. And June, the main character, lives in one of those top tiers. And literally the level of the tier has a lot to do with your level of privilege in this culture. And this is a culture that is ruled by women. But there is an annual election of a king or a prince called the Summer Prince, a young man who is voted on by the people, and he really is sort of symbolic. He doesn't have any formal power, but he can do a lot with his visibility until winter comes and he is sacrificed in the winter. And at the time of his sacrifice, he marks the person who will be the next queen with his blood. Well, June and her best friend Gil are really hoping that Enki, one of the candidates for Summer Prince, wins the election. And indeed, Enki does. And Enki is from the Verde, which is the lowest level of Palmeiras Trace. And it becomes really clear that Enki is going to use his position as Summer Prince to draw attention to the plight of the people in the Verde, who are really being exploited in this culture for their labor. They have horrible living conditions. Now June has a huge crush on Enki, but at Enki's first public appearance, it's Enki and Gil who have this instant attraction. And June is a little bit jealous initially, but it becomes clear to her that Enki, like June herself, is an artist. And she is fascinated when she realizes he's going to use art as one of the ways to convey this message about the plight of the Bear Day. And soon she is his collaborator in this. And they are just so sympathetic in their art ideas and using art as a means to spread the message of awareness and social justice. And then she discovers that she is a candidate for the Queen's Award. And the Queen's Award is something where you could have, basically your future is written if you become the winner of the Queen's Award. But she's not going to win it if she keeps doing this activism. So she really has a decision to make about what is most important to her. It's such a richly conveyed world with these teenagers who are, I think, dealing with a lot of really relatable things. It is also, the term that I come up with to describe it is a very sexually frank novel. Take that as you will. I will give you details if you want to talk to me afterwards.
And then Bill Koenigsberg, Openly Straight, and another really funny book that came out this year. The main character in this book is a boy named Rafe, who has grown up in Colorado. Rafe always knew that he was gay, and he came out to his very supportive parents when he was in 8th grade, and they were unsurprised by his news. And not just unsurprised, they were absolutely supportive about it. But he says, that's when the trouble started. I figured I'd come out to my parents, get my first boyfriend, and then just live my life. No, instead it was like this thing had happened, and now we all had to mobilize. I should have known my mom is a mobilizer. Suddenly there were 6 books I had to read aloud about what it's like to be gay. I said to her, Mom, can't I just be gay and not read about it? But she explained, and Dad backed her up, that we need to know history. Those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it, blah, blah, blah. Do you know how you get the urge to clean your room and it's no big deal? But when your mom tells you that you have to clean your room, you don't want to? Well, that's me anyway. So maybe if I had found all this stuff on my own, I would have really enjoyed learning about it. But instead, I got a pile of books from Mom, and now it was like I had gay homework from my mother. I was like, thanks for making this exciting new thing a chore, Mom. Awesome. And his parents don't stop there, because the following week they go to a restaurant in Denver. His friends are there. They're throwing a surprise party, and they have little birthday party hats for everyone, and on them say, "Yay, Rafe is gay." His mom becomes like president of PFLAG for Colorado, and really Rafe himself becomes sort of this poster boy of the really well-adjusted, supported gay teen. So he speaks, he goes and speaks at different events. He's really open about it. His school, at school it's pretty much like our man. Doesn't really have any problems, but it's now his junior year of high school. And he has decided that he wants to go to a boarding school in New England. And part of his, the impetus for him doing that is he wants to not be known as the gay kid. He doesn't see it as going back in the closet. He just feels like people know that's how they know him and that's how they identify him. And he's stereotyped. It may be positive, but it's still stereotyped and sort of pigeonholed. So he decides and gets accepted to the school, goes off, doesn't tell anyone that he's gay, and at first everything goes really well. He makes friends with the jocks, he gets on the soccer team, and he does pretty well. He also really likes his pretty quirky roommate and his friends, so it's kind of, he can just be friends with everybody, and people accept him as just a teenage boy. He makes a friend named Ben, and the more time that he spends with Ben, the more he likes him, and not just as a friend, and eventually, of course, he realizes he's falling in love with Ben. But what is he going to do now? So many of these books come down to truth and lies between friends, because either way it sort of seems like a lose-lose proposition. If he comes out and tells him that he's gay, Ben's going to feel like he lied to him, didn't really present himself honestly. But on the other hand, he's not going to be honest to himself if he doesn't tell his friend how he's feeling about him. Really a book that stands up for the way it addresses the topic, not a kid who's getting bullied, but a kid who is actually so embraced and welcomed that he feels like that's a label too. So very, very funny.
Yeah, he's got a Kick Your Ass by Magdalena. This was the winner of the Flora Belpré Author Award. It is a really quite extraordinary look at the impact of bullying on a girl's life in the context of a novel that has a lot of humor in it as well. So the main character of this book is a teenager named Pitty Sanchez. And Pitty has an experience that happens to kids sometimes. She gets to a school, she hasn't been going to the school very long, but she arrives one day and she hears in the hallway, Yaki Delgado wants to kick your ass. And she has no idea really even who Yaki Delgado is, let alone why she wants to beat her up. It's Darlene Jackson who explains the trouble I'm really in. She's a student aide in the guidance office and she knows all about Yaki Delgado. She was suspended last year for fighting. We're in the lunchroom, so Darlene has to shout for me to hear twice. I've only known Darlene a few weeks, but already I can tell she loves drama, especially if she has a front row seat and it's someone else's catastrophe. Darlene pushes up her glasses and tells me the whole rumor. Yaki Delgado hates you. She says you're stuck up for somebody who just showed up out of nowhere. And she wants to know who the hell you think you are, shaking your ass the way you do. Darlene lowers her voice. She even called you a skank. Sorry. I'm stunned. I shake my ass? Darlene studies her egg salad sandwich for a second. Definitely, yes. Interesting. I've only had an ass for about 6 months, and now it seems to have a mind of its own. So that is such a great sense of humor in this book. So Yaki lives with her single mom, really hardworking, very anxious single mother. And she's in a very, very vibrant Latino neighborhood. But as this situation continues to escalate, she doesn't feel like she can tell her mom, who is such a worrier to begin with. And we start to see isolation building around this, and we start to see her fear increasing. You know, it's just like bumping in the hallway, and it's things being whispered to her. And then it escalates to a really quite violent attack off the campus of the school. And she gets beat up. She still won't tell her mother what happened. And we begin to see just the psychological impact this has on Yaki as she draws more and more inside herself. And this is ultimately a book, even with all the humor, that really is about breaking the silence. And what we finally see is that for Yaki, the beginning of things getting better has to start with telling someone. And it has to start with telling somebody who can help her try to figure out what to do. So eventually it does come out, she goes to her mother, they go to the school, but a whole other dimension that we love about this is it's not like it's instantly going to be better. And so it really addresses the complexity that you can go to the school can say this is what we can do for you, but ultimately one of the things that the principal says is the best answer might be you transferring to another school, which is nobody's favorite solution, but it's also potentially a really realistic one, and that's another dimension of this book that we appreciated greatly. And then Open Mic riffs on life between cultures and 10 Voices is a collection of short stories, some of them funny, some of them sort of like an indivisible, really sort of in your face, but it's looking at literally not only life between cultures, but sometimes tensions that can exist within a culture. So an example, one of my favorite openings of one of these stories is it's a story in the voice of a boy who goes, so there's a white boy and an Asian girl who are waiting to both audition for the school talent show. One of them's a violinist and one is a stand-up comic. Which is which? And of course, if you're going to go with stereotype, you know the Asian girl, of course, is the violinist and the boy is the stand-up comic, but of course, it's the other way around in this story as these two kids connect while they're waiting to audition. So a great range of stories, and Matali Perkins also has a great introduction where she talks about humor being a great bridge to having some of these really important conversations.
A lot of people probably already know about Eleanor and Park by Rainbow Rowell because it's a book that just drew in a huge number of readers, and I think kids are telling each other to read it. It's set in the mid-'80s in Omaha, and it's about a really unlikely romance between two kids. Eleanor, a girl who's new at school, who's not conventionally attractive, and she wears odd clothing, and Park, a biracial Korean-American boy who has an easier time at school, but he's pretty quiet. And they meet initially on the school bus. When nobody wants to give Eleanor a seat, Park ends up letting her sit next to him, and then that becomes something that day after day they sit together. Park often reads comics while he's on the bus, and he realizes that Eleanor is reading his comics kind of over his shoulder, and so he slides it over, and they start co-reading without verbally acknowledging it, his comics together. And so it's just a romance that develops really gradually, and we start learning more about both of these kids' backstories, because Eleanor actually has just a horrific home life, really, really poor, and she has a very abusive and threatening stepfather in her home. Park has parents that very much love him, but he knows that they also don't entirely get him. Like, for example, when he decides to start wearing eyeliner, his dad just can't understand why he would want to do that. But we see the romance between these two kids develop over the year, and as things really come to a pretty horrifying head in Eleanor's home, it's Park who is there for her and ready to help see her through.
Orleans by Sherry L. Smith is a really great futuristic novel set in what is no longer New Orleans in this story. It's set in 56, and actually an opening page of this book before the actual narrative starts is just a list of all the hurricanes that happened after Katrina in the Gulf. And so that is the background that we need to understand when we start this book, that the government, because New Orleans became so devastated, the first thing they did was erect a wall around New Orleans and just sort of sealed it off, but they were still providing support and supplies, and then Delta fever broke out in the city. And they actually set up a research institution to try to inside the city, to try to track down the cause and create a cure for this incredibly contagious and deadly disease. Then Delta fever spread beyond the walls of Orleans, and finally the government just said, we're abandoning it, with all the people left surviving inside. So that is the backstory, and the two main characters in this novel are Fen, somebody who lives inside the wall of Orleans, and Fen is an O pos, and that means she has O positive blood, because one of the things about Delta fever is that it affects you differently depending on blood type. And so we see the social structure that has grown up in the remnants of this city, and it's divided into tribes based on blood type. So Fen is an O pos, and that means it is a blood type that's actually used in high demand for transfusions in this tribal society, because O positive blood can help people who have Delta fever live longer. And actually, near the start of this book, Fen's tribe is attacked by another tribe who wants them for their blood, for transfusions. And in that attack, the leader of her tribe is killed, and Fen is left with the leader's newborn baby. And all she can think about this baby is, I want to get this child out of this city. I want to get her over the wall so she has some chance of a life. The other character in this book is Daniel, and Daniel is a scientific researcher who lives outside Orleans. He lost his little brother to Delta fever, and he is convinced that the answer to a cure for Delta fever is in the records of that research institution inside the wall. And so he gets his hazmat suit, he gets all the protective gear he thinks he needs, and he sneaks through the wall to go on a mission to try to get this data. Well, he knows absolutely nothing about how to survive in this tribal culture. And he comes across Fen, and they end up forming this mutually supportive relationship, because she can get him to where he needs to go to get the information he wants. She's convinced he is her answer to getting this baby out of the city. And it is following them as they, that often with this great tension in their relations to one another, embark on that mission. So incredibly fascinating and gripping. And actually, Sherry Smith, her idea to write this book came out of Hurricane Katrina, when her mother, who was diabetic, was stranded without medicine inside the city of New Orleans for several days.
Still Star-Crossed by Melinda Taub is a novel that takes place 3 weeks after the deaths of Romeo and Juliet. And so Verona is just a city on edge. There's all kinds of tensions between the Montagues and the Capulets, and it's being really stirred up by some things that are happening. There's a masked swordsman who's sort of wreaking havoc on the city, attacking both families. And Juliet's grave has been desecrated. Someone wrote harlot across it. So the families are increasingly suspicious of one another, and Prince Aeschylus comes up with what he thinks is a foolproof plan to bring peace back. He is going to marry Rosalind, who, if you remember, was Romeo's infatuation before he saw Juliet, off to Benvolio, and then there will be a union between the two families. He ends up having to blackmail her to get her to agree. And Rosalind, who's the main character in this book, she is so not excited about this prospect. She knows Benvolio. She thinks he's kind of a jerk, arrogant. The last thing she wants to do is marry him. So when the two of them finally start to talk, and he's feels pretty much the same way, they come up with a plan. If they can figure out who that masked swordsman is, who's kind of doing this, if they can sort of solve that mystery, there no longer will be a need for them to get married. Well, you guessed it, they start spending time together, and of course, they start to fall in love. So there's another romance in this book, and then there's the complication of Prince Aeschylus, because actually Rosalind has always had a crush on him, which she thought was not reciprocated, but she finds out it is. So romance, never easy. And one of the things we learn in the Great Author's Note is also she talks a little bit about what it's like taking a piece of really classic literature that's taught in every 9th grade in the United States right now, and taking characters and continuing their story, what she chose to change, what she kept, and how she made that all work.
Amy Timberlake's One Came Home, another Wisconsin represent Newberry book. And this is a book set in South Central Wisconsin in 1871, which some of you probably know this. I did not until I read this book. The largest passenger pigeon nesting ever on record happened near Sparta, Wisconsin in 1871. And that is the backstory for this book, which is about 13-year-old Georgie, who lives in a small Wisconsin town. Georgie loves her life in her town. Her family runs like a general store, and she just knows her future is being in this town, running this general store eventually someday. Unlike her older sister Agatha, who has always wanted to go to college in Madison. But there's no support within the family for Agatha to do this. Now, this book starts, very sadly, with Georgie at Agatha's funeral. Only Georgie refuses to believe that the body they are burying is her sister. When the passenger pigeon nesting took place, it's followed by the pigeoners. It's like this whole onslaught of people looking for economic opportunity that would follow the nesting. And Agatha took off with some of the pigeoners. And when the sheriff went after her, he returned with a body. And the body was wearing a dress that their mother made for Agatha. The body has auburn hair, but the face had decomposed, so they couldn't recognize for sure who it was. Of course it's Agatha. It's wearing Agatha's dress. Come on, but Georgie is just absolutely in denial. That is not my sister in that box. So she is determined once the funeral is over, she is going to take off and look for her sister. She calls upon the help of Bill McCabe, a former boyfriend of Agatha's. She asks him to load her a horse. He comes up with a donkey. She's not thrilled, but he also insists on accompanying her. And this is about Georgie's search to find out what happened to her sister. There is so much humor in this book, which is written with such great descriptive language and metaphors that are so reflective of the time and the place in which it is set. But there's also, again, it's that great mixing of humor with the wonderful depth of the story. And then Jean Lewin's Boxers and Saints, an incredibly brilliant pairing of books, 2 graphic novels that you really have to read both of them to get the full experience. I really think of this as a book that's divided into 2. It does really tell us the story of the Boxer Rebellion in China in the first part of the 20th century, but it tells it from 2 completely opposing points of view. It doesn't matter which of the 2 books you read first, but you really do need to read both of them. So I read Saints first. And Saints is about a girl named she's known as Four Girl when we first meet her. She's about 10 years old. And she eventually meets a Chinese Christian man who begins giving her religious instruction. And she, at first, her motivation to go is that his wife makes really good snacks. But eventually she begins taking this religious instruction very seriously. And indeed, she begins having visions of Joan of Arc. And those continue right through her conversion to Christianity. She really has a connection with Joan of Arc. She ends up working with a priest named Father Bay in an orphanage, helping take care of children. And that orphanage is eventually attacked by a group known as the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fist, also known as the Boxers. And this was a group that formed because they really resented the presence of the British and the Christians in China. Then we get to Boxers, or you could read Boxers first, which tells us the story of a boy named Bao. And Bao is a boy who wants to learn martial arts. His brothers scoff at him, but he finds a teacher who begins instructing him and then sends him to another teacher who teaches him how to embody the gods when he fights. And when Bao's original teacher is murdered, he's so angry that he forms the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fist. So as we follow his narrative along, we get some of the same events we get from his point of view that we were getting from Four Girl or Viviana's point of view in the other book. And what's so brilliant about this is the way we get those 2 points of view on the same situation in China without any judgment. I think the parallel of her seeing visions of Joan of Arc with him being able to embody the gods when he fights, it's a wonderful parallel. You can't accept one without the other. And there's no judgment of those religious beliefs. You just have to weigh in on the actions that people take that are motivated by those religious beliefs. So really, really incredible history, but also a lot of humor. And I always say Jin Yang, I love his visual style for storytelling. It's very clean, it's very linear, and very easy to follow.
And we are on our last book, which is Bridget Zinn's Poison. This is a really great choice for younger teens who like fantasy with some adventure and a touch of romance in it. This is about an older teenage girl named Kira. She's a potions master, and Kira has just attempted but failed to assassinate Princess Ariana. Now that's pretty important because Princess Ariana and Kira are best friends. But the reason Kira tried to assassinate her is she had a vision of Ariana basically bringing about the total destruction of their kingdom. And she felt she had no choice but to prevent that by assassinating her. Well, she failed. Princess Ariana has gone into hiding, and Kira is on the run because everybody knows she attempted to do this. But she had not given up the mission. She wants to track Ariana down, but she needs a little bit of help, and she gets that in the form of a pig who's very, very good at tracking. She's at first kind of resistant to it, but let me tell you, this is an irresistible pig. And they form a bond, and then they are joined by Fred, a guy she meets wandering in the woods. She does not want a companion, but Fred really comes to her aid when she needs it. He proves pretty invaluable, and it turns out that a situation arises later where he needs some help, and Kira helps him even though she risks exposing who she really is. So, of course, there is more to Fred than meets the eye. This is just really, really lighthearted and fun. The title is Poison, but it's really sort of like candy because it's just addictive and you want to eat more and more of it.
So that is it. We are happy to answer questions one-on-one about either books we talked about, or books we didn't talk about, like the CCBC, or anything else. Ask what we think about Twitter. I don't know. So thank you for coming today.